Hello and a very warm welcome to today's BA Community webinar. My name is Adrian Reed and I'm really pleased to say that today we're joined by Sarah Coleman of Business Evolution. I first met Sarah several years ago when we both contributed chapters to the 2013 book, Business Analysis and Leadership, Influencing Change. I was really fascinated by the topic in Sarah's chapter, which covered power and politics within organisations. I'm sure this is a topic that is true to many of our hearts. As BAs, we often have to influence without authority, so this seems like such a relevant topic for our day-to-day lives. And so I was really pleased that Sarah agreed to join us this evening. Sarah has a really wide experience. She is fellow and former non-executive director of the Association for Project Management, a visiting fellow at Cranfield University, and a transformation associate SME and high-risk reviewer with the IPA Cabinet Office. She's written books including Project Leadership, Organisational Change Explained, and is an experienced coach and conference speaker. I'm really looking forward to Sarah's presentation this evening. Sarah will be making time at the end to answer questions, so please do type in any questions that arise into the chat box or the question window, and we'll cover as many as we can at the end. So with a presentation entitled Influencing Without Authority, Developing Organisational Intelligence, please welcome Sarah Coleman. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to talk about influencing without authority. And over the next half hour plus, I'm going to be discussing how to influence when you don't actually have the seniority or perhaps the hierarchical status within an organization to be able to simply direct individuals to do things that you want them to do. So first off, there's a spoiler alert. This isn't about what I would call extreme influence. It isn't about life or death, hostage situations, or negotiating with Taliban insurgents. This is about influence in an organizational and professional situation. It's about understanding how things work, how to remap your organization to make sense of power bases, politics, networks, and relationships. So much of what I'm going to talk about comes directly from my own experiences during my 30 years plus of professional career. My own background is actually in information and communications technology, and I started out many years ago as a trainee computer programmer, then working as a systems designer, systems developer, and systems implementer. I was a business analyst before moving into projects, programs, and transformation, and this has given me my grounding and interest in systems thinking. I also had the great luck also to be able to work across different industry sectors, primarily with multinationals. So we work now with organisations across industry sectors and public sector with government, both in the UK and abroad. And the focus of my work now is supporting organisations to work with projects, programmes and change to help them move through growth and periods of disruption. So why should I be interested in this at all? Well, we recognise that there are some areas of our own working lives and indeed our personal lives that we can directly control, and some areas that actually we can't directly control but that we can influence. So as business analysts, we often have the responsibility, as Adrian was saying earlier, the responsibility and accountability to do things and make things happen that we don't always have direct control over. And much of our energy is spent trying to make things happen and get things done, either for ourselves in order to meet those expectations and deadlines or on behalf of other people. And so to achieve this, we've got to be able to work confidently outside our formal areas of authority, move easily across all areas of the organisation, build influence and support at all levels, from the C-suite right down to the operational levels. So influence comes under the heading of organisational intelligence, making sense of power bases, politics, networks, relationships within your own organisation, but also maybe with other organisations, such as a client or any key providers that you have. And I was reading through Deborah Pool's thoughts on business analysis, and she suggests that this third wave of the profession is about advising. It's about working across the organisation, looking at value streams, advising organisations on the best way to spend their money. And she talked about business analysts progressively moving up the value chain to influence decisions, investments, and outcomes. And of course, all this depends on the organizational context. Not all organizations see business analysts working at those levels, or indeed not all organizations actually welcome input at this level. But essentially, this is all about delivering value and getting the best outcomes. And part of that ability to deliver value and best outcomes is simply the ability to influence and to develop that organizational intelligence. So who are some of the great influencers of our day? Here's a few who've made an impact on me and many others. This first one is, as you might recognize, Kim Kardashian West. And her net worth at the moment, interestingly, is estimated $175 million. She has 106 million Instagram followers, 58 million Twitter followers, and she branched out from reality television to create business empire that covers fashion, cosmetics, social media, and games. Along with other influencers, Kim has changed the way many of us feel about how we actually look, for better or for worse. And this is Nigel Farage. His profile derived from being an MEP, a past leader of UKIP, and ensuring that the UK had held a referendum on whether to continue to be part of the EU. And as such, he has wielded significant political influence well in excess of UKIP's own membership or voting power. And this last one is a lady you probably don't recognize at all. She's nowhere near as famous as Kim Kardashian West or as Nigel Farage. But her name is Anne Williams. And she's a key influencer that you may never have heard of. Anne Williams lost her 15-year-old son Kevin in the Hillsborough disaster of 1989. It was her fight to get this inquest verdict of accidental death overturned and led to fresh hearings for all the fans who died. She began a solo campaign to establish what really happened to her son, and despite no legal training or even higher education, she simply refused to give up. She organised an independent pressure group called Hope for Hillsborough, which later joined with larger Hillsborough Justice campaign, which she went on to chair. And she became one of the figureheads for the victims' families in their quest for justice. She really was a key influencer. So organizations are changing. The need to influence isn't something that is particularly new to the business analysis and project management communities. We've always had to move across teams, functions, departments, locations, as well as up and down the traditional hierarchies in order to be effective. But the new reality is that hierarchy is being replaced today by something else, by the ability to make relationships, use influence, work through others to get results. Effectively, this means that to be highly effective, our technical skills need to be augmented by these softer skills of networking, collaboration. This is not an either or, this is an and, it's a rebalancing. And it's simply not enough anymore to expect that only our technical ability will get us where we really, really need to be. So what is influence? Well, there's no one single agreed definition of influence, but a few of the suggestions I've come across are these. Note here the language used and the neutral tone. There's no indication here of ethics or the right or wrong of a situation. No indication of whether this is for self-serving purposes only or for the greater good of the team, the project, or the organization. In other words, there's no context here for the ethical application of influence. I've also included some of the ideas from Daniel Goleman's work, since his work has influenced the way we think about emotional and traditional intelligence. His work's been around probably for the best part of 30 years now, and his original work and research into psychology and neuroscience gave us new insights into the different dimensions of our rational, but also our emotional sides. He talked about self-awareness as the ability to recognize and understand your moods, your emotions, your drives, as well as their effect on others. And it's in particular, it's this effect on others as the key to influence that we're really, really interested in. So whereas IQ generally refers to the mental abilities for collecting and handling, analyzing and reasoning in relation to information, EQ focuses on your ability to recognize your own behaviors and moods and thoughts. And even more important, it's the ability to manage them in a range of different situations, to shape your interactions and relationships with others within a particular context. Dale Carnegie first published his work on how to win friends and influence people back in 1936, but it's pretty much continued to be an influential text and business bestseller ever since. And although Dale Carnegie died in 1955, his work continues to influence new generations. His work really underlined the need to cultivate good working relationships. People always prefer to say yes to the people they like. And we're quite familiar with stakeholder identification and stakeholder mapping and stakeholder engagement, but I want to take it one step further here. So my last full-time employed role before I started my own business was as a program director for British Telecom. I led very large, complex, high-profile projects for their multinational corporate clients. And when I walked through the door, the first day of my job, day one, my manager advised me to build my own informal network right across the organization. As a matter of priority and urgency in order to make things happen, you can well imagine that BT had plenty of formal processes and procedures, and plenty of people fell foul of them. But making those relationships, creating mutual dependence, identifying informal power bases, made the difference when favors need to be asked and called in. So ONA, Organizational Network Analysis, really allows us to map the informal organization that's not visible in the usual organogram. What is actually happening throughout the organization that you actually do not see typically on a hierarchical chart? So think about a person who has particular influence within your organization. What is it that actually allows them to have that influence? Why do they have that kind of influence? Why do people allow them to actually have that influences? Because key influences in organizations are often those that people trust and they go to talk when they have a question or a problem or just need to talk things out. You find them at all levels and right across all functions and teams. So part of the skill of influencing is understanding who the right person is to approach. And I say right because you need to focus on the people who matter rather than using a scattergun approach. Find a way to get to them, even if it's through someone else. An organizational network analysis and the work that's being done at the moment is really based on principles that we've seen in social networks, social media networks, and actually also in military intelligence. It helps us define all of the various nodes and hubs and understanding where those routes of influence and those routes of communication actually are and where they lead. So influencing skills is a huge topic in its own right, but I'm going to focus on just two aspects here. And those aspects are our own influencing style. That's how we prefer to influence, our natural style of influence. And secondly, our use of language, which is a little more subtle. And what you're going to see now is a long list of the ways in which we typically influence. And there's quite a variety there. So we've talked about the fact that influence is practiced by being persuasive, managing the emotions of others, and it's done by sensing the emotion of others, by understanding their perspectives and motivations, and by responding so that you can move a conversation or a meeting towards your desired outcome. When we talk about influencing stakeholders, for example, in business analysis or in project management, it's a fairly neutral thing. There is an objective or a goal, and your role is to enable it to be achieved. But this still means that influence can be positive or negative. Good influencers have the ability to impress without strong force, to appeal, to influence with integrity. And really, the focus here is on interpersonal communication skills and relationships. Negative or coercive influence uses things that that you should see here around manipulation, intimidation, being embarrassed. And actually, it's very difficult to be on the receiving end of this. So what about influencing styles? If these are the ways to influence, what about the styles that you might actually use to do this as well? Well, this particular style, influence style indicator, is from MHS. So what's your influencing style? We all typically have a preferred or a natural style of doing things, a way that's comfortable for us. So we've got 5 here, and the first one being asserting. Do you insist your ideas are heard and considered? Do you debate? Do you pressure others to get them to see your point of view? Or perhaps you use convincing and rationalizing instead. Logic, facts, reasoning. Do you leverage facts, logic, expertise? Basically, this is about using empirical evidence. It's using reason and logic to take others with you. Or perhaps you prefer negotiating, compromises, concessions, trade-offs, win-win situations. What can we both do? How can we both win in this and go forward? Or perhaps it's around bridging, uniting, connecting. This is about coalitions, collaboration, co-creation. Or perhaps the last one, inspiring. Do you encourage others? Communicating a sense of shared mission, exciting possibility. This is about building the future vision that really appeals to others. So there are 5, this particular style indicator uses 5 different style preferences. And we all have our preferred way of influencing and a natural style of doing this. So Adrian, if I can ask you now to have the poll, to bring the poll in.
Fantastic. Yeah, so I have just launched the poll. So if you are live on the webinar, you should see a poll pop up now. So if you could click on the particular style which is relevant for you, and I can see people are starting to vote now, which is fantastic. So we'll just we'll give people a few minutes to vote. It's interesting. I can see a pattern emerging. Okay, if we just give you perhaps another 5 or so seconds. So if you haven't yet hit the button, just hit the button. And okay, so I shall end the poll now.
Okay. Now I understand from Adrian talking before this that possibly the rest of you can't see the results. So I'll just work through them if you like. We have a clear indicator here of convincing, rationalizing at 57%. Next we have inspiring at 19%. Then we have an equal pairing next of asserting and negotiating at 10%. And bridging comes in at 5%. Now I allowed another because I wasn't sure whether people would necessarily see their own preference within the terms that I've suggested here. But I think, as you can see as well, Adrian, that the clear winner here is convincing and rationalizing. So this is about logical and empirical evidence, which actually is actually quite interesting. It indicates a lot of the technical abilities that you have. And when we go on next to language and use of language, you might see how this relates to that. So that was the poll. But you might want to consider as well a question I have here. Is the best style to have one that you're comfortable with, or one that lands well with whoever you're talking to? And I ask this because if you ever only stick to a single style, you'll only get the best out of a particular situation of context. If you'll be able to flex your style, that is to be able to use more than one style of influence according to the person on the receiving end, or according to a particular situation or context, you'll be even more successful around this. So I'm going to move now on to use of language in influencing. And this is a favorite quote, which I often use mainly because it works at so many different levels. I think it speaks to me really strongly insofar as this is not just about the type of language that you actually do use, whether that might be Hungarian, Slavic, English, French, Russian, but it's about the type of language insofar as how it appeals to other people and the kind of stories and the memories that you bring about by using particular types of language. Because business speak and the way that we in our professional lives go about conversing with others is dry. It's quite stark. It lacks in depth and expression. And certainly most of the time it lacks emotion. It's very different to our natural way of talking and expressing ideas. Language is an experiential thing. It influences what we remember, how we remember it. It impacts our emotions and it revives experiences and memories. And some of us are very visual in our preference about how we perceive and relate to the world around us. We like pictures, we like colors, we like design. Others are auditory. We like sounds, rhythm, tone, cadence. And others again are kinesthetic. We rely on feelings, our gut, how we react to things. So knowing someone's preferences, motivations, how they see the world, how they use language, so that you can use this and actually reflect it back to them. And this can all help you understand how to influence a particular individual and get down and dirty. So let's have some examples here. So if I was visual or I'm talking to somebody who was visual, you'd hear phrases like, I see what you mean. It looks good to me. I get the picture. I don't see your point. Let me show you what I mean. And can you see this in your mind's eye? So if you're hearing that language from the other person, you know what language to try and reflect back to them. If you're auditory, then you might be using phrases like, I hear you, or it rings a bell. Music to my ears. Nope, I've tuned you out. Okay, let's talk it over. Does this resonate with you? And again, if you're kinesthetic, what you might be hearing or you might be talking about is, that feels right to me. I don't feel good about this. I can't grasp the point. I can't get a handle on it. What you're suggesting just doesn't feel right. Or let's touch upon the points another way. So improving your ability to influence at an individual level and improving your own influencing skills. Reciprocity has been called the first weapon of influence. What it means is that in helping others to achieve their goals, you create reciprocity. A major driving force behind reciprocity is fulfilling debt. It's human nature the idea goes, to want to repay debt. When we receive a gift or favour from someone, we feel compelled to return that act. And in fact, we'll go to great lengths to repay our debt. And it leaves us guilty or ashamed if we don't. And that's the way the story goes. So we've got the first law of reciprocity. The second law is about authority. We're more likely to comply with someone who is an authority, but that's about hierarchical status. And there's the law of liking. We're more inclined to follow the lead or be influenced by someone who's similar to us rather than someone who's dissimilar. Or the law of commitment. We value commitment and consistency since they're associated with strength and honesty and stability. So people basically feel they're obliged to give back to others the kind of behavior or the service which they receive first. If a colleague does you a favor, you owe that colleague a favor in return. And put very bluntly, and this goes back to Dale Carnegie, people are more likely to say yes to those they owe a sense of obligation to, as well as those that they like. So not only is reciprocity a seemingly simple concept, it's also one that works again across cultures and distance and even time. So there's one story which has stayed with me, and it's 1985, and a devastating earthquake has just hit Mexico City. And Ethiopia, which has never been a prosperous country and has repeatedly suffered famine, sent $5,000 of relief aid to Mexico to reciprocate aid that Mexico had provided Ethiopia 50 years prior, when Italy was invading Ethiopia. The amount was small, $5,000, it was small, but the gesture was enormous and acknowledged a debt of gratitude. So these things do build up, and it's a good way, to influence others and to actually bring in those favors for yourself. So getting down and dirty, how can I improve my ability to influence? Well, these first three are really about positional power, but we're trying to move away from positional power and talk about how we influence others through our behaviors and through our conversations. So the next two really focus on knowledge and experience and access to information. So expertise, having the knowledge and experience, the technical ability to do what you need to do. And the information, you have access to particular information needed. These two final ones really work on contacts, networks, and connections. Wanting to be or associated with you, knowing vertically, horizontally, in and out of the organization. So where's your focus? Is it internal or is it external? Does it go across peers? Does it go across levels of seniority as well? And one of these things here, which I think about quite a lot, especially around, quote, stakeholder engagement, is about actively managing relationships. Just like stakeholder mapping and engagement that you do within your role, you'll know that you just don't do this once and assume it'll remain the same and constant throughout the whole of the life cycle or across what you're doing in your role. People move in and out of roles. They get promoted, they move sideways, sometimes move out of the organization altogether. And relationships and your ability to influence are dynamic. They're not static. They're fluid. They can be redefined. And because of that, they actually need review. They need reappraisal and renegotiation. And basically what this means is keep in touch and keep it personal. So another set of ideas about how can I improve my own ability to influence. These are my additional 8 ideas born from my own experience. And I know that you'll have your own as well. And actually, I'd be very interested to hear from you about what you think is particularly relevant for you to be able to do this well. So the first one is about raising your profile. Whatever you do, raising your profile, stepping up and getting noticed, whether that's in social media, blogging, actually becoming an author, a researcher, whether you talk at conferences, at seminars, whether you coach, whether you're mentor. And then there's the obvious one, network, network, network. I live and die on what I do from our network, and possibly you do too. This is about being able to demonstrate what you know and what you've done, and going in for industry awards as well. And I'm sure that the business analyst community has a set of industry awards, just like all other industry sectors do also. So get noticed in that way too, because actually it gives you a lot of credibility, and it does provide you that platform to start that influence. Track record. This is really about your CV, your direct professional experience. Been there, done that, and got the t-shirt with it as well. Personal branding. What is it that makes you stand up and stand out from everybody else about you? Why should people actually listen to you? Why should they go to you for your thoughts and ideas around this? And really, this is about stepping up and being seen, not just within the organization you work in, but also within your profession community as well, your industry sector, your professional body. Go volunteer, go get a board position with them, go do something with them that will actually make you, will broaden your horizons, but also get people interested in what you're doing to be able to start generating that type of influence. Understand other people from their social media profiles. We talked about the use of language and how to understand how people think, and by the kind of language that they actually use, and being able to respond in the same type of language. This is about trying to understand what it is that is important to people, what keeps them awake at night, what are the issues that they're facing, and being able to relate to that too. And finally, to model yourself on good influences. Throughout our careers, we all look at people and we take role models, and we take particular aspects of people that we think do things incredibly well. So find those good influencers and model yourself. Start modeling yourself and seeing what it is, what is the essence of what they do that makes them so good at what they do. So how do you find out about those people that you actually want to influence? Well, speak to people who have worked with them. Find out more about them on LinkedIn, on Twitter for social media. And if you really want to start stalking them, look them up on Facebook. But Google them, look on the internet for updates about them in the media as well. What are they doing? What are their thought processes? What are their motivations? What's their focus of attention? Why are they? How are you actually going to make that first connection with them and keep that connection with them too? So finishing off now, this is what I call my cheat slide. It's a visual which captures and summarizes all the various areas and themes around influence that I've talked about here. In summary, the new reality of organizations is really about the ability to make relationships, use influence and collaboration, and work through others to get results. In other words, we need to be able to operate without the authority of a hierarchy, and that's traditionally defined and given us our influence and power base. But here influence is now about building strong relationships at all levels, becoming organizationally intelligent, creating your own brand, trust and credibility that people will relate to. And these are all regarded actually as signs of personal and professional maturity. And this is where sitting down to take a long, hard look at your own level of influence and organizational intelligence comes into play. Now, some of the ideas and concepts I've talked about in this webinar can be found, as Adrian suggested earlier, on the chapter on dealing with power and politics for business analysis and leadership. But I'm going to suggest other books that I would certainly recommend. And so these are Shelley Rose Charvette's Words That Change Minds. And this one looks more closely at the use of language and preferences for when you do need to get down and dirty to influence. There's also Robert Cialdini's Influence, which is generally considered to be one of the main texts around influence. And then finally, Jeannie Laborde's Influencing with Integrity takes a lot from the ideas of neuro-linguistic programming. I hasten to add that there are lots of other books out there, plenty available, but these last three are just those that I found particularly useful. So, look at influence as the capacity to mobilize, not just people, but also resources to get things done. It is definitely a legitimate and very useful tool to manage what you do effectively. And actually, your team and project will benefit from your ability to influence well. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's been my pleasure to talk about influencing without authority. My name is Sarah Coleman. Thank you for listening. And I'm going to hand back to Adrian now. Adrian.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sarah. And we have a whole stream of questions coming in. So if you do have questions, then please do type them in. We'll cover as many as we can live. And our first question is around networking. It's a fairly long question, so I'll just paraphrase it. I think the essence of the question is the person is suggesting that networking can be quite an intimidating term. How can we make networking seem less intimidating? Tricky question.
I think that's a wonderful question. It might be a little bit about language as well. Networking intimidating, perhaps, but maybe another way to explore it would be around collaboration and co-creation. I noticed that there's quite a lot being talked about co-creation and multidisciplinary teams. So I think perhaps describing networking in a different way might help that solution. The other area that I think that question also kind of brings up is that how do you network effectively? How do you step into a room where you know nobody and actually make that first connection? Because I tend to agree, it is quite intimidating when you don't know anybody and there's a big room in front of you, you step through that door and you wonder how you're going to approach this. And I can only suggest a strategy that I used when I first went out and put my own business together and faced exactly this, which is the best piece of advice I was given was to make a strategy. So find the people in the room or get introduced to people in the room that you particularly want to talk to. And if you need to really start a conversation from scratch, use anything, even the color of their socks or the fabulous shoes, anything that will strike up a conversation. It can be the most mundane thing, but actually it will get the conversation started and you can build it from there.
That's great advice. I love the color of the socks analogy because it's so true, isn't it? That just finding something to talk about, and then it sort of, it leapfrogs from there. I remember, just reflecting as well, a piece of advice I was given, which I still use to this day, because it is frightening when faced with a room full of strangers. Is if all else fails, just put your hand out to shake hands and say, "Hi, I'm Adrian Reed." and actually that seems to work, because then you can lead into a conversation rather than sort of standing on the edge feeling awkward.
And I think that's a good way to do it, is actually going in all guns blazing. And you'll find that people are very receptive to that as well. And nobody's going to turn around and say no. People are very receptive. They understand that networking events are quite, or can be, a little difficult for a lot of people. So they are genuinely open to people coming to them and introducing themselves. Well,
that's it. And what was going through my mind as you were saying that is actually, I think probably the majority of people at those events are quite, or a good proportion are often quite reluctant. I know often when someone comes and introduces themselves to me, I think, oh gosh, that's good. It means I haven't got to initiate contact with a stranger. Someone's done it for me.
Exactly.
Okay, so our next question is, what opportunities could we seek to practice different influencing styles? Are there any case studies or tests?
Any case studies or texts? The Robert Cialdini book, How to Influence, actually does have a number of case studies in there, which are quite interesting. One of the very simplest ways you can start to do this is when you next have your one-to-one conversation in your organization, a professional conversation, is simply to really listen deeply about not just what you're being told, but how the other person is speaking, what kind of language they're using, what their body language looks like, how they are expressing themselves, where their silences are. All of this will give you indications about their preferences and what they're thinking and how they're thinking about it. And being able to start talking in the way that matters most to them can give you immediate rapport. And that's a very easy way to very quickly get through the initial barrier of talking to people. One of the ways I would suggest, but this is not for the faint-hearted, is to go and talk with the person you really prefer not to talk to. And we all know them. They're people in an organization that might give us real problems. But actually deliberately seeking them out and talking to them can be quite helpful. And the way I've done this before, when I've had to do it, and I sometimes have to steel myself up to go to them, because I know that mostly it will not end well. I go ask for help. I deliberately put myself on the vulnerable scale and say, I know that you're very knowledgeable, very expert in this particular area, and I could really do with your advice and guidance in this instance. And that is actually quite effective, because people often like to be asked for help. They like to be acknowledged in what they can do and what their strengths are. So I found that to be quite useful as well.
That's great. And again, in terms of building rapport, I guess they feel valued. They feel that their expertise is acknowledged. So yeah, I can imagine that being a very effective technique as well. So okay, so moving on to our next question. The question is, are there questions we can ask someone if we're not able to interpret what someone's language is to effectively communicate with them? I'm guessing this is around the communication styles.
Nice one. I like that one. If their language is coming over in the very expressionist dry, and I'm going to generalize horribly here, but I often find that finance people are people who rely a lot on facts and figures, and I find them quite difficult to try and define what their particular mode or preference is. I'll start shooting out phrases at them and seeing how they respond to them. So we talked a little bit about phrases, if you're visual, auditory, kinesthetic. So I might start shooting out something fairly simple like, oh, I see what you mean. Oh, can you paint me a picture around this, please? Because I still don't quite get the essence of it. Or I might say, I hear what you're saying. That really does ring a bell with me. By throwing out those kind of phrases quite deliberately, you can see you can hear what comes back. It's not going to work the one time. You may have to do it a few times and use each of those preferences. So the visual, the auditory, the kinesthetic, to see which one they actually latch on to. And you may have to talk with them. It's not going to be a matter of a couple of minutes. It might well be quarter of an hour, half an hour before they start to reflect back anything that you can actually use in that manner.
It's interesting. Just bouncing off that point, Sarah. There's one person I remember working with a while ago, and she's the only person I can remember thinking about those modes. But she would talk about how things didn't smell right.
Okay.
Is that a common mode as well, or is that a sort of edge case?
That's a wonderful one, and that's a really wonderful one, and I'd probably the closest to that would probably be kinesthetic.
Yeah.
Most of us are actual visual. The literature tells us that many of us, or the majority of us, are visual. So by all means, start out with that, because that's the easiest, and that's the one that people will probably relate to fairly immediately. And then you can work through to auditory, which is the next most popular, and then to kinesthetic.
Mm.
Smell right, I love. I think that's great.
Yeah.
But I put it down again, probably just lump it in with the feelings and the kinesthetic bit.
Definitely. Okay, so our next question is about profile raising, and specifically about blogging and tweeting. And the question is there a danger of blogging or tweeting without knowing what to talk about? So does that hurt your influence?
Oh, without knowing what to, I wouldn't be doing it purely for the sake of doing it. Nobody, when you're blogging or tweeting, one of the easiest ways to start, if you're not quite sure, is actually to leverage off things that are posted on LinkedIn for a start. That's a good way to do it, and throw out stuff that's on LinkedIn as well that genuinely interests you, not just bombarding and not just a scattergun approach, but stuff that genuinely interests you. Start easy by doing that. Twitter as well. Start easy on Twitter. It's a specific number of characters, so you actually have to be quite focused about what you want to say and how you're going to say it. There is a fair amount, having said that, there is a fair amount of stuff on LinkedIn which is general. Sometimes it's quite biased. So think about what you actually want to say. Start with the end in mind is something that I always use from Stephen Covey. Habit number 2, begin with the end in mind. What is it that you want to convey? Who do you want to convey it to? And what's the best way of actually being able to say that? Most blogs are written between 500 and 800 words. That's kind of my limit, Adrian. I don't know what you typically do.
Do you know what? 500 to 800 is also the limit I use. But what I found is that actually with blogging, that small is beautiful. I mean, but it's really, really hard to write that way. But small is beautiful.
Yes. And there's nothing to stop you from taking an idea that's already out there and developing it a step further and using that as a blog. And that's quite useful to do as well. And it helps you develop your own style and know where you want to go. So starting small can often help you take that first step.
Absolutely. And just one thing to add to that, a personal reflection, I remember speaking to someone a while back who was talking about a particular topic, and it was really clear to me that he didn't know how much he knew. He knew so much that he took it for granted that I was encouraging him to blog and speak about this topic because it become like tacit knowledge to him. But actually, sometimes it's obvious to one person, but it's actually a revelation to others in the community potentially.
Yes.
So, okay. So our next question: what techniques are effective when dealing with a tight-knit, exclusive group? For example, senior managers or leaders who have worked together for many years, socialize with each other, etc. Tricky one.
It is a tricky one, and I think that the first question I'd be asking is what is it about this group that you need to be able to influence, and is it the whole group or is it a particular individual or set of individuals within that? Because breaking into a group like that you'd need a strategy to do it. So what are you trying to do? If it's related to a particular piece of work, then it's about okay, let's start with this one. Most decisions taken at senior level, you're absolutely right, are taken outside meeting rooms. There you have the conversations, you lobby in the corridors, you meet over coffee, you have the exchange of conversations outside meetings. So if you're trying to influence a decision at a meeting, you actually need to start quite in advance of that meeting. You need to start outside in the informal setting rather than inside. So it's a matter of, the way I would probably approach it is to start picking off the individuals within that group that I know had the most influence over the others, and making sure that some way to get time, whether that's going through their gatekeeper, which is typically their PA or secretary, or by being in the same place at the same time that they are, whether that's simply in a lift or down a corridor, to have a conversation.
Fantastic. Tricky subject, but some useful tips there. Okay, so our next question is: can we use a particular style of influencing according to the type of characters we liaise with? Is there a model we can use?
That's a good one as well. The influence style indicator that I suggested, and I've given you the website address for that as well, does talk further about the types of people that it works best on. So if you know, again, if you understand the person that you're talking to and you're trying to get that rapport with, if you understand, for example, that they relate mostly to logic and empirical evidence, you might well go for the logical and evidence-based approach. So when I asked about your own preference to style, and everybody has a preference style in all kinds of different ways, and then I asked the question whether you're able to flex that style given the situation, the person that you're actually trying to land this with, and that was really the reason for the question. So if you know this person is introvert or extrovert, for example, whether they are more in tune with emotional intelligence or whether it's very technically biased, it's finding out about that person in advance. So talking with people who've worked with them, finding out their backgrounds. If they're on Twitter, looking at Twitter, what they tweet about. If they're on LinkedIn, what does their CV say? Is there anything that you can pull out of there that you can relate to? And it's not always, you won't always find when you go into with a preferred style of influence, it won't always work first time. I mean, it's a matter sometimes of actually working through various scenarios to come to a spot at which actually they will start to relate properly to you. So this is not you'll get it right first time, because people often don't behave like that. And sometimes they might be having an off day. So it is about trialing things with them and understanding that actually you won't necessarily get it right first time.
Yeah, interesting. Absolutely. That sort of iterative and experimental approach, learning along the way. Okay, so our next question is: how do we influence people in an environment where stakeholders are geographically dispersed, and you often talk to them over the phone to engage with them? And I'll build upon that question and sort of elaborate it further. I guess it could be phone or web or video, but not in the same place.
Yeah, this cross-cultural one and virtual teams and even virtual teams within a region or a country and across countries as well is a very interesting one. And I did talk about reciprocity because it's a thing that people talk about most of all. It's and I will say to start with, without doubt, it's always better to have the ability to go and eyeball somebody face to face with a project. Even if you have to, I went to London the other day to see a client. It was the beast from the east, and there was lots of snow, and I wasn't actually sure I'd actually be able to make it in. But I thought I have to do this because the very first meeting I have to be able to eyeball them, and they have to be able to eyeball me. and make sure that I can do what I say and I'm credible and that I look the part and I can do what I say I'm going to do for them. So I went there and did it. Now, I got delayed 3 hours on the way back, but actually it was, for me, it was completely worth it. And I have run projects where I've deliberately had to put in budget to fly over the pond to meet a team that I'd be working with, simply because you're absolutely right. The eyeballing and the face-to-face is actively by far and away, the best way of doing it.
Absolutely.
But I think the other thing is about collaboration tools, and that's possibly where your question is leading here. And as you say, Adrian, there's a good number of collaboration tools out there. There's webinar. Skype is a great one. I know they do Skype for business now as well as personal Skype, but actually being, again, the face-to-face is very useful, important to be able to do, to watch reactions and facial reactions. But if you are stuck at the end of the phone, then the same reasoning applies. You can still listen to the language. You can still listen to the hesitation and the silences. You can pick up lots of things just by listening as well as seeing.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, if anyone is interested in the virtual side of things, in fact, the editor of the book, which you and I wrote that chapter for, was, of course, Penny Pullen and James Archer, but Penny has subsequently written a book called Virtual Leadership. And in fact, there's a previous webinar that Penny presented around virtual leadership. So if you go to the Blackmetric website and click on webinars, you can find that there as well, which might be interesting as well. So, okay, so just final question, and we're into the last couple of minutes. So it's quite a tricky one, unfortunately, for last, but we'll see. We'll see.
Okay, we'll try and unpick it then.
Yeah. How do you reconcile adapting one's behaviour and language and being fake or not genuine or maybe manipulative?
Oh,
it's a really
how very nice. I like that one. That's more of a challenge. Okay, so there is a difference, and I think when I talked about influencing with integrity, I was trying to make the point here that pure influence is for better or worse. It depends on how you do it and what you want to do. And there are plenty of people out there who are very willing to influence by embarrassment or intimidation. But this is about you, and ethically you, about how you choose to behave. You always have a choice. I think the bottom line for me is certainly everybody always has a choice about doing this. So influencing with integrity is about, for example, appealing to values. You might have particularly deeply held beliefs about what's good and bad, or important or unimportant. You can appeal to their moral sense. You can vision as well. Influencing with integrity looks at appealing to values, but also visioning as well. This is about the way you choose to do it. So if you choose to do it in the form of manipulation, and sometimes there are reasons to do this, and let me give you an example. A little while ago, I did a very similar talk about influencing without authority to DSTL, Dhanashire Newton, which is a military base. And afterwards, and so we went through this, and afterwards, one of the sergeants came up to me and he said, I use embarrassment and intimidation an awful lot. And I said, in what circumstances? And he said, well, in very specific circumstances. And I said, well, that's possibly fine, because if you're in a situation which is dire, then you probably need to get people to react immediately rather than have a long consensual conversation about why this is the right thing to do. So there may well be situations in which this is a reasonable thing to do. But I think most people, especially in a professional organisation, much prefer to have an adult-to-adult conversation rather than a parent-child conversation.
Absolutely.
So,
really, really all about that context.
I think so. And I think it's also a bit about your own moral compass too.
Definitely. Definitely. Okay. Well, time has hit us again. We are at the end of our slot. So if you could just move on to the final slide, please, Sarah. So first thing to say is a massive thank you, Sarah, for joining us. We had a whole number of questions. If we weren't able to answer your question live, I apologise. Sarah, would you be happy for people to tweet you and email you if they have questions that weren't answered?
Absolutely. Always very interested to hear your ideas and your suggestions and your questions. So you're very welcome to do so.
Fantastic. And how is the best way for people to stay in touch with you, Sarah? Is it LinkedIn or Twitter, or do you have a blog or a website?
Shall I just go back to
yeah,
if I may, then my contact details are up there. So I am on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter. And by all means, my mobile number is there, and also my email address. So you're very welcome to make contact.
Fantastic. And the webinar is being recorded, so if you don't catch these live, you can watch them on the recording as well. So if we can just have the final slide again, Sarah. So a massive thank you to Sarah for a really, really interesting and practical session. I'm sure we all gained a huge amount from it. I know I certainly did. And also a thank you to everyone who is attending live or indeed is watching the recording. As a reminder, this whole series of webinars really is about the BA community, and the vision really was to get talking or to encourage conversations around topics that perhaps we don't talk about as much as we could in the BA community. I'm pleased to say we've got two other really interesting webinars lined up already. On the 19th of April, we have a session about agile and business analysis. It's an expert panel. So if you are a BA in an agile environment and you've got a burning question, please come along to that and come prepared with questions. That'll be quite a different format. I expect that'll be a very, very popular one. So when you log out of this webinar, there'll be a link. So be sure to click onto that as well. And then you can see there's a really interesting session on persuasive and powerful presentations as well. So do tune in for that one as well if you can. So thank you again, Sarah, for a really interesting and inspiring presentation. Thank you to everyone who tuned in as well. So good night, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you.